So I'd like to proudly introduce Craig Miller from Defenders of Wildlife. Craig is Defenders Senior Southwest representative and has led Defenders Regional Wolf and Jaguar Conservation Program since 1993. He has served on the federal recovery teams for the cactus Varanus, pygmy owl, and the gray wolf, and currently serves on the executive committee of the Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project. And they're in the back if you'd like to visit them and hear what they're all about. He is also a co-founder and active board member of the Northern Jaguar Project, a binational collaborative effort to conserve jaguars throughout their northern range, and he currently serves as a conservation fellow of the Rewilding Institute. Craig has been active in Southwest conservation issues since 1987. Prior to joining Defenders, Craig conducted forest inventories for Southwest Environmental Consultants and worked as an outdoor adventure guide and naturalist. Throughout this period, he has also volunteered as a wilderness study area doctor for the Arizona Wilderness Coalition, as a wolf advocate through Preserve Arizona's Wolves, and as a board member of the Arizona League of Conservation Voters. So obviously he's going to have a lot of really great things to say. And on a personal note, I seem to see Craig in every wolf movie I watch, because his opinion and expertise is highly prized, and so it's with great pleasure I introduce Craig Miller to all of you today.
Well, thank you. I hope I don't disappoint you too much here. As Betsy mentioned, I have a long history with the wolf program, and I just wanted to point out that back in the late 80s, early 1990s, we had a volunteer program that had adopted potential wolf reintroduction sites throughout the Southwest. That in Arizona's case, they were evaluating 11 sites. And one of those was the Red Rock Secret Mountain Sycamore Canyon Complex, which was the site that I was responsible for back then. And it's been bittersweet to learn that just within the last few weeks, one of our wolves from the Blue and Gila complex had dispersed all the way from near Springerville out to between Stoneman Lake and Mormon Lake. It's been a couple months there. Tragically, that wolf was hit by a vehicle. But the good news is, wolves have demonstrated their ability to adapt and survive and disperse, and they're at the door. If we can remove a few more obstacles, wolves are going to do their thing and make a full recovery. And we'll address some of those obstacles later on in my talk. This was a looping video that shows one of the last wild Mexican gray wolves live captured in Mexico. After an exhaustive effort, similar to what Carter described in his talk, by private individuals and the federal government in the United States to eradicate Mexican gray wolves, which used to live throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and West Texas. So in 1978, this particular wolf was trapped by Roy McBride, a trapper from Texas who'd been contracted by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to help prevent the taxon's extinction. And those last 5 were brought into captive breeding facilities and eventually bred with 2 other small groups of Mexican wolves that had previously been held in captivity in Mexico and at a private ranch in New Mexico, and yielded what we have today. So bottom line is, the entire wild population comes from a captive breeding program that stems from just 7 individuals. As Betsy mentioned, I am the Senior Southwest Representative for Defenders of Wildlife. We're a national member-based wildlife conservation organization. Our mission is that we are dedicated to the protection of all native animals and plants in their natural communities. And that's somewhat unique among national wildlife conservation organizations. And what's behind that is that we work to protect wildlife regardless of the value to humans. And that doesn't mean they aren't important, that we don't recognize the importance. But our mission is to protect animals, restore animals in their habitats, regardless of whether we, at this present time, view them as important. Now, in this particular case, wolves are tremendously important because of the tremendous important ecological role they play, and for a variety of other reasons, ranging from spiritual reasons to ethical to economic, and I'll touch on those a little later in my presentation as well. We're going to focus on the Mexican gray wolf, also known as El Lobo or Canis lupus bailey. Mexican gray wolves are the smallest subspecies of gray wolf in the world. 50 to 80 pounds is a typical range. Males tend to get a little larger than females. And how many of you were at the film Q&A the other night? Okay, I said this might be a little redundant for you, but they're basically the latest thinking on wolf taxonomy tracks the idea that there were basically 3 waves of gray wolves that came across the Bering Strait into North America. And Canis lupus bailey was the first form of gray wolf to come across the strait, the land bridge, and occupy North America. And when the next wave occurred of new Canis lupus nubilis, it kind of pushed bailey further south into its range, into its current range in Arizona, New Mexico, and down into central Mexico. And then the third wave with Canis lupus occidentalis kind of pushed nubilis over into upper eastern Canada and the Great Lakes area, and the occidentalis now occupies that region of the northern Rockies in the lower 48 up through the Yukon. This may be redundant for some of you, but wolves and humans have a long history of coexistence, and just a couple of fun examples on the left. This illustrates the story of Romulus and Remus and represents sort of the historical relationship that humans and wolves have had. The story goes on that Romulus and Remus were cared for by a she-wolf, and through that process learned quite a bit about wolf society, and some of those values are represented today in modern family structure and even in some of our political and social order. And in North America, there are numerous accounts of human communities living closely with gray wolves and adapting hunting strategies and replicating social structure, which helps improve their efficiency. Kind of a fun story is the hypothesis by an evolutionary ecologist named John Ullman, who asserts that by living closely with wolves, humans, when we dispersed from Africa into Asia and Europe, started to domesticate wolves. And by living with wolves and dogs, we improved our efficiency in hunting and our ability to survive by having an extended family structure where the adults share the responsibility to care for the young. That allowed us to out-hunt and out-compete Neanderthals. And in that sense, we owe our very existence to our partnership with gray wolves. And the stories go on and on, just bringing that home. When wolves were eradicated from the Southwest, regional Apache tribe, White Mountain Apache, kind of lost touch with wolves in some of their stories and prayers, and thus what was once called the wolf song became the horse song. And for decades, men have been singing in ceremony about the horse song, men going to the mountain, praying to hear the baying of the horse for sustenance and strength. But it turns out, with the wolves being returned on tribal lands and in the area, some of the elders recalled the wolf song, and now the wolf song is being retold and sung once again in ceremony and shared with tribal members. About the Apache men, before going out for a hunt or before going out for battle, would pray to be like a wolf, to have the strength of the wolf, to hunt together as a wolf, to improve their efficiency. So clearly, we've had a long history of coexistence up until the other big migration or wave of an invasive species in livestock. And when livestock were brought into the American Southwest, they largely displaced native prey, elk, deer, pronghorn. And that, combined with subsistence hunting of large mining operations, nearly wiped out most native prey populations. And livestock, larger, slower moving, easier to kill, largely replaced the native prey. And the wolves that were here didn't have a choice but to take what was available and more efficient use of their energy. And that set them up for a major conflict. Carter did a really good job, I think, of describing the work of Wildlife Services and the agencies that preceded Wildlife Services. But nonetheless, the trapping and eradication campaign was really At its heyday between 1915 and 1973, and it successfully resulted in the complete eradication of Mexican gray wolves from the U.S. portion of their range and reduced the population to just a handful of individuals in Mexico. Fortunately, as I mentioned in relation to the first little video clip, the Endangered Species Act was passed, and at the time there was a growing consciousness of our responsibility to do a better job of safeguarding creation, and the effort was made to live capture the last remaining wild wolves in Mexico to start a captive breeding program. And that breeding program slowly grew to expand to about 43, I think there's 43 breeding facilities now. There are about 300 wolves plus in the captive breeding program, which intensively manages those wolves to minimize the effects of inbreeding, depression, and maximize the preservation of genetic diversity to the extent that you can, with having only 7 founding animals comprised of only 1 female. While the breeding program was taking place, efforts were underway to try to figure out a path forward to help wolves reintegrate into the landscape through experimental reintroductions, and part of that involved howling surveys throughout historic wolf range to make sure there weren't any remaining individuals that might contribute to the genetics of the population, or that might, a residual pack that might actually help facilitate a restoration program. And those those efforts took place over the course of about 8 years and yielded no concrete evidence of wild wolves remaining in their historic range throughout the U.S. and in the U.S.-Mexico borderlands in northern Sonora and northern Chihuahua. And while that was taking place, there were also public meetings and plans being made to figure out a way to get wolves from captivity back onto the land. And that involved many dozens of public meetings throughout Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas. And these are actually images taken from some of those public meetings representing the sentiment, even in relatively modern times, and the belief that wolves had no place in our society or in our landscape. But at the same time, there had been a growing ethic among, I'm not going to say better educated, but more empathetic people who also have very strong feelings about the wolf program, and that remains today. This is actually taken from a relatively recent New Mexico Game and Fish Commission meeting. So the result of all those meetings and many other meetings through stakeholder collaborations and knockdown, drag-out discussions about if wolves were ever to be restored to the landscape, what would it take for people to live with them or to accept them back in the landscape. The compromise was reached that resulted in what's called an experimental non-essential population. It's a subcomponent of the Endangered Species Act that is intended to achieve management flexibility for controversial species like wolves, so that they can at least experimentally be returned to the landscape. This is the most recent composition of that experimental rule. I'll try to describe just very briefly or generally what's going on here. Emily actually understands this better than anyone I know, and she has some maps back at her table. Emily with Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project underneath the trucker's hats back there. She has a map similar to this that's easier to read, and she's really good at interpreting it for you. But generally, the area inside the red line is where wolves are or soon will be allowed to occupy or disperse into. And there are 3 zones in there. Kind of the core area, generally where you see most of the green, is zone 1, where releases are allowed to proceed. Releases and or what's called cross-fostering in pups. I'll talk about that a little bit later. The wider zone around that green area is generally zone 2, which after a period of time, after the first 5 years of this rule, which was adopted 3 years ago now, I'm sorry, it has a kind of a swinging door policy. Then wolves will gradually be allowed to occupy those areas and or be released in those areas, and then the kind of shadier area around the periphery, zone 3, where wolves will be allowed to disperse into and recolonize, but there will not be any active translocations of wolves into those sites. And that's, that's good and bad. What the green and blue represent there are habitat suitability analysis results. So the green area is basically where the results of 3 different types of modeling identified suitable habitat for gray wolves based on things like prey abundance, road density, trying to get at the potential for conflict with human activities, water availability, and those sorts of things. The blue area represents those areas where at least 2 modeling exercises had shown, modeling processes had shown where suitable habitat exists. And then the areas without the blue or green are generally considered suboptimal. Back when the compensation program was initiated, reintroduction was initiated, defenders had made a commitment to offer livestock compensation. We would pay fair market value for all verified livestock lost to wolves. I had the enviable position of administering that program for the first 12 years of reintroduction. I got to know many ranchers under pretty heated circumstances for the first 12 years. But it actually created a great opportunity to learn more about their concerns and share ideas about how we might work together moving forward to avoid these types of conflicts and be more proactive and figure out ways to address the problem further upstream in a way that resulted in fewer dead cows and in many cases dead wolves. Let's see, the first Mexican gray wolves were released in 1998, making this the 20-year anniversary of reintroduction. So we're celebrating 20 years of having wild wolves back on the landscape in Arizona and New Mexico. Interesting enough, the gates were opened on, the wolves were first brought into their pens on Super Bowl Sunday in 1998 with Secretary Babbitt out at Hannigan Meadow Lodge. It was quite a show. And then later in March, those gates were opened, and we were able to provide wolf guardians for a couple of months who stayed out there providing perimeter security and supplementing feeding the wolves, and really a life-changing experience for those folks who've been and had the opportunity to be a part of righting a wrong with this. But one thing I still think is really problematic and plaguing the problem today is that there's a real lack of realism, a realistic understanding of the dynamics on the ground and the strength of the feelings that many people have about wolves on both sides. And it's very difficult, makes it very difficult to come together to find solutions. But I'd like you to just assume for a moment that you own livestock that were lost to wolves, and you weren't in a position where you could afford that year after year, and you hear messages that imply that wolves are here to stay, and based on your understanding of wolves and wolf recovery, that threatens your livelihood and your existence, and the possibility that you might be able to pass your ranch on to your kids, and you're about to lose everything that your grandparents worked hard for you to inherit. That's the perspective many people have. For them, that's what the wolf symbolizes. And for others, livestock symbolize this most ridiculous boondoggle in the history of politics, and probably the most ecologically unsustainable form of agriculture production, and just the epitome of an imbalanced system that isn't fair to wildlife, and it doesn't represent broader public values. And I think all of those are true, on both sides of the equation. At least the fears and the perceptions are true, and it's important to acknowledge that at least they're valid, if not true, and they result in real world problems. So on one side, some people in one camp think the only rightful place or appropriate place for wolves is in captivity. And on the other side, they think the only right thing to do is either get rid of cows, or that ranchers should bear all the responsibility for preventing conflicts between wolves and lions and bears and all predators. But to find a solution requires trust. It requires trust that if a rancher steps forward and is willing to work with a conservationist, that they're not going to be outed and ostracized in their community, that we're not going to put spies on their ranch to learn more, get to dig into their personal business, or to get to just gather ammunition to force them off the land. And that's the perspective many ranchers have at the outset. They don't want to work with the environment. They're afraid of the risk of exposure. And I value my privacy too. I'm real reluctant to open up to folks that I don't know, especially if I think they have questionable motives. And on the other side, the conservationists think, well, we have no reason to trust these guys. Why would we want to provide them with radio telemetry equipment so that they could monitor wolves and know where the wolf locations are, because they're just going to go in and kill the pups or shoot them or worse, And so there are some risks involved in making a good faith effort to overcome those and to put firewalls around those, I think, is really essential to moving forward. One of the most important things I think happening, aside from the fact that it's my program, is a program we coined as coexistence, and we call it conflict avoidance or conflict reductions. I've learned that most ranchers really don't like the word coexistence, but are willing to work with us on ways to reduce the vulnerability of livestock to wolves and other predators. And just real briefly, what we do, typically this time of year, is now that wolves are denning, pups will be born between now and the next couple of weeks into early May. They've localized, and we'll look at where their core use areas are around the den sites. We'll estimate home range based on previous patterns, and we'll overlay those colored areas, those are home ranges of Mexican wolves, with the other boundaries on the map. And I'm sorry that's so fuzzy. It's actually intentionally vague, so we don't give out specific information on where dens are. But that's overlaid with a grazing allotment map, and then we'll identify who the ranchers are, and we'll do the door-to-door mercenary work and work with the agencies and meet with the ranchers and talk about the potential for range rider partnerships, see if we can't figure out who would be a good rider in that community, whether it comes from within their community, a son or daughter or neighbor, or it comes from the conservation community and somebody who's a young wildlife biologist who's interested in getting involved in human-wildlife conflict. Every situation is different depending on the circumstances and the willingness of the rancher to try new things. And in every case, we operate these on a cost-share basis, 50-50. We'll provide a stipend for the rider with certain expectations outlined in an agreement, including protecting the anonymity of the rancher. So we don't give out names and ranch names any more specifically than a rancher in Apache County or Catron County. And I get calls every day by the reporter, and I don't blame them, because any reporter worth their salt would want to interview, that elusive person who ranches with wolves. But once you do that, it changes things for the producer in a way that they don't really want. They're not into ranching to become a spokesperson for collaboration or for accommodating the wolf. They risk being, as I mentioned, outed and ostracized in their community and criticized from outside the community, and they end up spending a lot of time on the phone with writers, and that evolves into a lot of time with photographers and then filmmakers, and no offense, Katya, but it opens up the door to a never-ending stream of activities that take time away from the thing that they really want to do. And so we work to try to protect it, which makes it really difficult to raise awareness about this program, because it's like, it's kind of this elusive thing and we can't give out names, but it's essential to build the trust and to be able to sustain these programs. And there have been cases where ranchers have been ostracized within their communities, which in a way that affects their kids in school to the point where they've left the community. This is what some of the range rider work looks like. It's focused on increasing human presence, which is one deterrent technique. Wild wolves particularly tend to avoid contact with people, and range riders reinforce those interactions through the use of strobe lights. They carry these 4,000 lumen strobe lights with them to provide a visual deterrent, along with a little air horn, like a little marine boat air horn. Or some use rubber bullets and are trained in the use of rubber less than lethal munition, and it'll provide a little sting, a little physical reinforcement if wolves get too close to cattle. And there are a variety of other tools that can be used. In some cases, riders use telemetry equipment where collared wolves are involved. In other cases, where there aren't collared wolves, we'll use motion sensor cameras. I can describe a little more of that. But really, there's two sides of the equation. One of them is focused on deterring wolves from taking an interest in livestock through the use of deterrents, and strobes and lights and air horns and sirens, and the other is focused on management of livestock in a way that improves the herd integrity, improves the herding instinct in the presence of predators. One of the natural defenses is to bunch together, work together to defend against predators. Mothering up, having cattle with good mothering skills so that when predators are nearby, they get their cows together. Having a herd leader, and I'm going to go into more detail during our coexistence talk on Friday about these tools and techniques and what it takes to get these programs off the ground. But these are other examples of the types of things riders do. They look for the presence of wolves through scats and tracks and blood and broken bones, and closely monitoring the behavior of cattle herds. It's fairly easy if you spend time with livestock to know when they're stressed due to the presence of predators, and that's the time to pay attention. It means if the rider's there, he or she is going to have their bedroll with them, and if wolves are in the area, they're prepared to spend the night, throw their bedroll out and be there with a strobe light or an ear horn or rubber bullets. Or the rag boxes that Carter mentioned, the radioactivated guards. I think I have a picture, I'll come back to that in a second. Another strategy involves removing livestock carcasses, which can serve as an attractant. And cattle die for a lot of reasons. Predation is just a very small percentage of the reason why livestock die. But carcasses near a calving pasture can serve as an attractant to bring in bears and lions and eagles and ravens and all kinds of other potential problems for the calving operation. So removing carcasses or rendering them inedible is another strategy. What would Carter do to this thing? Okay, there we go. As I mentioned, livestock die for a variety of reasons, and there are ways to reduce the enticement of predators into the area. Flattery is another tool that's used to cordon off pastures. This is a visual deterrent that's intended to discourage wolves from moving into occupied pastures, and it can be quite effective around calving grounds. Or if you're moving, in this case, well, in one of these cases, we used it for 3 bands of sheep, so 3,000 sheep moving across multiple forests through 5 wolf pack territories. It was quite effective, completely eliminated losses to wolves and reduced losses to bears and lions, and increased the overall performance of the sheep operation because it improved accountability and close monitoring. You know, the shepherds had to be on hand to maintain the flattery, and because they were there, they had greater accountability for their operation. I'm going to show you a video, test video. This just demonstrates a test that was set up in partnership between Defenders and the Washington Park and Wildlife Flattery. So you've got this portable electric wire, these dangling flags set up around a carcass, and we're just trying to test the effectiveness, whether or not flattery was an effective deterrent, could be used to discourage predation. Getting hungry. In any case, you may have seen, if any of you get out near Sunrise, we have a flattery project that's been going on for a number of years there. A big pasture near Sheep Crossing, just north of Sunrise Ski Resort there to the east along the highway. It looks like you'll see these flags dangling, looks like a used car lot. around the pasture. So it's kind of fun. It does draw attention to the ranchers, and they do tend to get ridiculed by their neighbors. But it's also been really helpful at reducing losses and conflict and stress and increasing tolerance for wolves in that area, which have occupied that area literally since the beginning of the program. So ranchers in that area have been tolerant of wolves for 20 years in the area around between Big Lake and Highway 260. So that's kind of ground zero for wolves in Arizona, and it involves a handful of the same producers who've owned those private land, the deeded lands, and have and manage the grazing allotments on forest land in that general area. So it's not like you roll these out as a new idea every year. It involves maintaining a relationship as well as getting one started. A couple of other tools here down in the bottom right. That's called a fox light. It's a random strobe light hanging on a fence line or a fence post. It serves as a visual deterrent. They just go off randomly in different colors at night. It replicates a flashlight moving through the forest, and we might put 6 or 7 of these around a pasture at night, and that in and of itself is not effective. But if you combine that with a range rider who periodically shows up and stays all night with a light and with livestock in the pasture, and every once in a while intervenes with wolves to move them out of the area or communicate with them that this is not in your best interest to be hanging around these cattle, it can be quite effective. There have been cases where the livestock have learned too that it's a safe area, and they bed down near or under the fox lights. Air horns, strobe lights, bottom right, there's a starter's pistol. We actually use, it's a thunder load. It's a non-lethal. There's no load, it's just a sound, a really loud explosive sound that you can shoot out of a 20 gauge or 12 gauge shotgun. And then those are cracker shells up on the left side. They're just like fireworks you shoot from a shotgun. Not the wise thing to do in fire season, but can be an effective tool after there's been some precipitation. We also require riders to communicate and record all their observations and compile that information so that we can share experience from season to season and continually strive to improve the effectiveness. It also gives us some confidence that the riders are actually out there doing work and not just hanging out at bars or coffee shops in town. Livestock guarding dogs, another tool. We don't use these as frequently as we'd like to. They've been effective in sheep operations and the situations that we've utilized them in Arizona. We haven't really used them extensively for cattle operations, although we're looking forward to doing that here in the next year or so. And we use a variety of combinations of tools. This particular photo actually comes from a project in Chihuahua, Mexico, which is being implemented by partners of ours, which we also support by providing flattery, portable electric fencing, strobe lights, etc., kind of replicating or learning from our experience in the States and sharing that with our partners south of the border. This is a RAG box that Carter was mentioning earlier. It stands for Radio Activated Guard. These devices emit a strobe light and an audible sound, as Carter mentioned. We've got low-flying helicopters and gunshots and cowboys yelling and screaming. And they can be effective at deterring wolves from entering a pasture, but we've also found that they're really effective as an alarm clock for a rider. So if a rider's out in the evening, and the riders typically go out early evening and monitor for wolf locations, and then get the cattle together and find an area that's easier to monitor, help the livestock settle down and bed down in an area where there's a reduced opportunity for conflict. And then the rag box will let them know if they need to get some sleep. If a collared wolf shows up, this thing's going to go off and you can hear it a mile away easy. So it has a multi-purpose. It's not just a deterrent. The other tools involve supplemental and diversionary feeding. That's using things like hay or salt and mineral blocks, or even water. And then in the case of the wolf pups, using carnivore logs, which are just processed meat logs, to help keep them located in areas away from a high probability of conflict, away from roads, away from hunter camps, away from calving pastures, and working the livestock into the equation to keep livestock away from den sites and rendezvous sites. We're also trying to compel the Forest Service to integrate livestock management guidance into the forest plan into their allotment management plans, their annual operating instructions to producers. I think at this point, this is the most important thing we can do to help normalize and institutionalize conflict avoidance practices. Because if they're able to do this, new ranchers or ranchers who are in the path of wolf recovery who have no experience whatsoever of managing cattle in the presence of wolves, or new permittees who move here from Texas or Oklahoma and get a permit in an area that's had wolves for 20 years, will have the ability to benefit from the experience of previous producers and land managers. But right now there's resistance from the Forest Service to institutionalize this. And ironically, one of the reasons that's used is because these wolves are managed as what's called a 10J, or experimental non-essential population. The whole rationale for that was to provide management flexibility to help reduce conflicts and manage wolves, to help them integrate in the landscape. But ironically, that very flexibility is being compromised because of the interpretation of non-essential. The Forest Service has gone on record as saying because these wolves are non-essential, meaning because they're backed up in captivity, nothing we do can result in the jeopardy of the wild population. Therefore, we don't need to consult with other agencies and that. Now, I should say, Forest Service does communicate with the other agencies and participates in the interagency field team on coordination, but formally, there's no mechanism to provide this guidance to permittees. And as wolves move into the Tonto and onto the Coconino, everyone would benefit by having that guidance and ability to plan for wolf presence up front. Dan, I'll go over more of this in more detail on Friday. Another entity that was formed several years, I think 6 years ago, is called the Mexican Wolf Livestock Council. And we have taken the concept of post-mortem compensation, or a situation where you're paying for dead cattle, and converted that into a really progressive conservation performance-based reward system, where instead of paying for dead cattle, we're now providing incentives for live wolves and conflict avoidance. And so the partnership looks like this. We'll provide cost share to producers. So let's say we contribute $100,000 or $150,000 in a year for range rider projects. On a cost share basis with producers, they provide an equal amount in kind in the form of bunkhouses, use of a truck, horse, tack, saddle, fencing, equipment, that sort of thing. Our 150 plus their 150 yields $300,000 of non-federal money that we then work together with the state, in this case White Mountain Apache Tribe, New Mexico Department of Agriculture, and Arizona Game and Fish Department to receive, on grants, to receive matching federal funds that then come back to the Coexistence Council or the Mexican Livestock Council that goes to further conflict avoidance and performance-based incentives. So essentially, it's a system that improves accountability because everybody's in the game. All the parties have skin in the game. We've all got money and time invested in in this on down the line. Participate, but they don't have a vote. So the perception is that it's locally owned and operated, and it's not perfect. And I'll talk more about that on Friday too. But it's one of the best mechanisms around, in my opinion. The payments are based on wolf success. It's based on the number of wolf pups that survive to the end of the year. It's based on whether or not a livestock producer is utilizing conflict avoidance tools and management strategies. And it's also based on where the location is, which gets out, where the livestock operation is, which gets at the issue of exposure. So this map illustrates 3 grazing allotments. The blue hexagon is generally what we call a home range. And home ranges for Mexican wolves can range from 50 to 200 square miles. The yellow hexagon would represent a core use area where wolves spend 80% or more of their time, where there would be a den site and or a rendezvous site. And so these are all factors in not that complex of an equation, but we look at all those factors and combine them together and then factor in how many applicants we have. I think this last year we had over 40 applicants, which included tribal livestock associations. So those would be individual ranchers from Arizona and New Mexico, and 4 tribal livestock associations from White Mountain. And San Carlos looks like they're going to come on board this year. And it's exciting because, as I mentioned, now we have ranchers actively thinking about how we implement this program and how do we fund it and how do we perpetuate it. And we've got agency folks thinking about how do we institutionalize this? How can we make this the norm rather than the anomaly. Similarly, we're trying to replicate some of this work in partnership with the White Mountain Apache Tribe. Super excited this year. We have 3 tribal livestock associations who are in a really important wolf-occupied area in the northeast portion of White Mountain Apache tribal lands, who have agreed to share a range rider and actually work with us on developing an integrated livestock management plan focused on reducing conflict and focused on other ecological benefits, keeping livestock out of riparian areas, etc. And we're working with the tribe. We collectively, conservation organizations, Emily's group, Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project, involves members of White Mountain Apache Tribe in the Big Lake Holiday Weekend. She's got information about that event, but there's a subgroup of Apache tribal members who helped us out with what we call the Apache Wilderness Journeys program. It's basically non-consumptive wildlife tourism that works with Emily in preparing food and storytelling, and there's an opportunity for horseback rides, and we continue to develop programs to help the tribe benefit from wolves in a way that promotes both wolf recovery and traditional Apache culture. And similar, as I mentioned, partnering with folks in Mexico to help establish a second wild population. They're 5 years into the program now. I think this is their 6th year actually. They just released a family group in February. The total population is 37, and they're very helpful for pups this time of year now. So hopefully in the next 2 weeks we'll have good news about what's happening south of the border. So here's just a very dumbed down version of a recovery vision, and this is based off of hundreds of different types of studies, including habitat feasibility analyses and debates over historic range and which portions of the western landscape are currently or could possibly be suitable for wolf occupancy in the near future. So I don't think I have a pointer. If I do, I don't know how to use it. But in any case, if you can hear me, this is the current wolf-occupied area, these little green blobs on the map. Here's our population in Arizona and New Mexico, and here's the population in Chihuahua. The vision is to restore multiple populations or subpopulations to create a meta-population, which is basically connected subpopulations across the landscape. What the foremost scientists who were convened by the Fish and Wildlife Service to develop a recovery plan concluded after multiple recovery planning processes was that in order for Mexican gray wolves to persist, to ensure their future, to provide the greatest chance of success, you need a minimum of 3 connected populations comprised of at least 750 individuals. And the Fish and Wildlife Service was about to roll this plan out, after it had taken over a decade and multiple planning processes of multiple groups of the very best thinkers on wolf population ecology and population persistence. And then the states of Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, and Colorado intervened, to say the least. And the program was shut down, recovery team meetings stopped, and the states rolled out their version of what would constitute recovery. The Fish and Wildlife Service, by and large, adopted that. And that recovery plan was just rolled out last fall, and we're currently in court challenging that based on the science-based recommendations of the very scientists that the Fish and Wildlife Service had recruited in the first place to help develop a scientifically valid recovery vision. Again, I encourage you to talk with Emily. She's really knowledgeable about all this and has good maps, can help interpret this, and I'll be available after the talk if you want to talk more specifics about that. Here's a simplified version of what we're asking for and what science shows is possible relative to the current Mexican wolf experimental population area. And I think I'm probably getting close on time here. But why is this important? There are numerous reasons, as I mentioned. There are ecological reasons, ethical, spiritual, economic, egalitarian. But the ecological reasons are the most exciting to me. It's just been fascinating to learn all of the impacts that wolves at an effective level can have in terms of changing the behavior of grazing ungulates and herds of elk and deer, and the effect that that in turn has on grassland regeneration and erosion. And when I mean erosion, I'm talking about soil rolling downhill into the watershed and increasing turbidity and changing the temperature of water and changing conditions for native species like Apache trout and affecting aspen and willow and cottonwood tree regeneration. And it isn't that wolves are the panacea of everything perfect and they aren't going to achieve peace in the Middle East, but they are responsible for at least part of a very complex system that has changed dramatically in their absence over the years. And even with the restoration of a relatively small population of wolves, we're seeing desirable outcomes. There are also cultural reasons, as I mentioned, the wolf song with the Apache. It presents a really unique opportunity for young tribal members to re-engage in traditions and to get involved in hands-on management. There's a new program we're supporting with White Mountain Apache Tribe this year called the Tribal Youth Wolf Conservation Program, and it employs 6 young tribal members to work on the Apache tribe's wolf management team with monitoring and working with livestock associations to reduce conflicts and performing peer-to-peer outreach within the tribe. And then there's wildlife ecotourism. I don't need to say a lot about that, but I did pull a figure from Arizona in 2014. Bird watching alone generated $838 million just in trip-related spending, which is associated with about $1.2 billion in total revenue for the state. And this is shocking, and I'm still trying to ground truth this, but I want you to look at this for just a second. The global terrestrial biomass, this is the biomass of all land mammals distributed across the planet. And this is by Professor Emeritus Valclav Smil, who's from the University of Manitoba. And it essentially takes the biomass of all land mammals and compares them. And you know, I've worked in the field of wildlife conservation for a long time, and I saw this and I'm dumbfounded. I just can't wrap my mind around it yet. I found a handful of other studies that reinforce this. Now I'm going to spend a little more time and try to assign exact percentages to this because the numbers are a little elusive. But the results that I've seen so far generally support, you know, this outcome based, 18 years ago. And anyways, it's astounding to me. But I'm presenting this in the context of why wolf restoration and all it represents is important. You know, we are everywhere, and whether we like it or not, and we recognize it or not, we've assumed the responsibility of determining which forms of life are and are not going to survive moving forward. And that's a tremendous responsibility. And up to this point, most of those decisions were based on a complete lack of information, a lack or outright ignorance of science, and simple convenience. As Carter mentioned, described, many of the predator eradication programs, they took place because they were there to protect a particular industry or a commodity that has a disproportionate amount of influence in our political system. But we are at, in my opinion, and I think this is reinforced by many scientists, we are getting close to the tipping point for losing, some of the most important ecological actors on the planet. And I don't know how many of you have kids. I do. I know that's an ecologist's sin. But I care about them, and I care about the future, and I care about critters, and we have the responsibility to do our best to learn as much as we can and make our decisions that determine the future and the future of our society on the best available information and knowing in good faith that we're doing the right thing. And in this case, I know that solutions are possible. They are hard-won. They're too few and far between. But we still have the opportunity, in the case of Mexican gray wolves, to create a future that ensures their survival, and I think has the ability to significantly enhance our own. I want to thank especially Emily's group, Grand Canyon Wolf Recovery Project, because I somehow left it off the list here because I put this together really quickly. But I'd encourage you to go back and talk with her and see if there are ways that you might be able to support her efforts. And got one last little clip for you. This is a pack of wolves that was taken with a motion sensor camera right around Thanksgiving, a little before Thanksgiving. Kind of remind me of the Apex pack. So I'm probably out of time, but I'm happy to take questions if that's possible.
Yes, of course. If anyone has questions for Craig, please.
I'm wondering, just as a further planning for ranchers, if there's any push to create a certification system, kind of like Dolphin Safe Tuna, where they can actually label their product as predator safe cattle practices, or something that would maybe push them into a different market, like Whole Foods and people who are wanting to buy organic and make them more competitive.
I think so. I can tell you in the early years of the program, go ahead.
Did you want to address the predator-friendly dinner with predator-friendly
I do
certification?
know about that. Is that so that's happening?
That's what that is. It's the new dolphin safe tuna from Amazon.
Great.
Sorry, I just wanted to say that because I was like, oh, God.
Perfect. So I think the short answer is yes. I think there are unlimited opportunities for that. I will say we experimented with a Wolf Country beef label in the early years of the program from '98 to 2001 with a handful of ranches and a couple of outlets and a health foods chain distributor, and learned some really valuable things that I think could help instruct a new initiative in the region. And I know ranchers are interested in doing that. We can talk more about it, but the bottom line is, in order to make it successful, you have to come in at a certain scale to be able to get on the shelves of Safeway or Bash's and go toe-to-toe with IBP, the International Beef Packers, who really have a lock on the market. And in order to do that, you have to have many ranchers and a certification program that's believable, so you have a consistent product on the shelf. The consumer component of it's easy. Generating awareness, getting media splashes, earned advertising is easy. The difficulty is in figuring out how to get into the markets, how to provide a consistent product, making sure you have legitimate certification, and then the whole distribution issue is challenging too. Otherwise, you'll end up with a bunch of beef that you have to sell at a farmer's market out of a cooler, and that's not profitable. Yes?
Craig, you mentioned a desire to use dogs a little bit more, especially in the cattle area. What are some of the impediments or hurdles that need to be gotten over to using the dogs?
There's still uncertainty about whether they're a liability or an asset when you're working in near a wolf or rendezvous site, where wolves tend to be territorial, and wolves tend to not differentiate between other canids, between wolves and other canids. So they very likely view dogs in their territory during breeding season as competition, which could be problematic for the guard dogs. And it also, there are a variety of types of guard dogs that play different roles. There are some that are bred and trained to intervene directly through defense and really fight the wolves off. There are others whose primary role is to serve as an alarm, so that when wolves are in an area, you have a range rider or a rancher or a shepherd nearby, and they can take over and intervene. We just have to find the right mix, and then you have to find, it's also challenging to find the right partner who's willing to experiment with that sort of thing. But it's something we're looking forward to doing. We haven't done much of it in the realm of cattle. It's been quite successful with sheep, but the sheep operation that we were working with quit running sheep about 4 years ago, so we don't have that option. Yes?
Just reminded me, llamas are used to guard sheep against coyotes. They're probably not effective against wolves, or are they?
Well, I've heard conflicting stories, but I don't have any direct experience with that. So, I know we did work with an alpaca farmer or owner last year in Arizona, and she was legitimately so concerned about her alpacas, and so we employed flattery and fox lights and successfully discouraged the wolves from denning in that area. They moved to the other side of the mountain and had great success. But I don't have any experience with llamas.
Another question. Do wolves have characteristic individual howling songs? Can they be identified by their song as, individually identified?
You know, I assume so. And, yeah, I mean, howling is an important form of communication, but it's difficult to know what a wolf is saying. I mean, I've participated in howling surveys for years, and I'm always trepidatious about it because you never really know what you're saying, let alone what the wolves are saying when they respond. So not really directly answering the question, but I assume so, but I don't know for sure.
I'm interested to identify an individual like Stump or Rail.
Yeah, I would,
Wolf
I assume so. That seems highly probable, but I don't know for sure. All right, thank you very much. Oh, that's one more.
One quick, I have a phrase that had llamas and horses, and the llamas would keep away any stray dogs that came on the property and run away from the defensive posture and pace up and down the fences. So taking down certain on that guard against
Donkeys too, and both in wolf country and in jaguar country, donkeys are being employed and have had pretty good success. If they're raised properly and believe they're part of the herd, they've had pretty good success at deterring depredation from predators. Yes.
Several years ago, Anatolian shepherds were introduced in Africa because they were having trouble with the cheetahs killing cattle. And this has been quite a few years ago, but we had like 90% success, I understand, with the Anatolian shepherd. It's a Turkish breed, so and the livestock farming.
Yeah, that's one of the breeds that a gal who breeds predator deterrent dogs has recommended in our situation, so that it will likely be something that we'll be working with shortly.
So guys, thank you. We're gonna have to stop questions for now.